Hi again, students. Welcome to week 3 of this summer class. So I'm going to be covering chapter 7. Chapter 7 is on consumers, producers, and market efficiency. So first things first, what is welfare? When you say the welfare of something, right? So in economics, welfare means how better off is the economic agent, right? So if you're dealing with consumers, aka households and individuals that buy stuff in the goods and services market, then welfare would be how much we are getting or benefiting from purchasing the goods that we buy. So for instance, when are consumers most happy, most satisfied? Whenever we get discounts, right? So whenever we're able to buy things at a cheaper price, then consumers are most satisfied and have a better welfare in general, right? So that's welfare for consumers is called consumer surplus. Okay, so we're going to be starting off with consumer surplus. And basically, this is your willingness to pay minus your equilibrium price. I'm going to call that EP. So what is willingness to pay? Willingness to pay means how much do you value a product, right? So for instance, you go to a restaurant, right? You're hungry, you want to buy some burger and some fries, right? How much do you value that food at that point in time? So probably your value is for $10, right? And then the price that you're selling it there is $13, right? You're not going to be willing to buy that product because your willingness to pay is lower than the price that you're selling it, right? So the only way consumers are happy in the market is if their willingness to pay exceeds your equilibrium price, okay? So that's when consumers are happy and satisfied in the market. So let's put this in a graphical form. So you have your demand curve, right? Okay. And then this highest point on the demand curve is your willingness to pay, okay? And your equilibrium price, remember your equilibrium price is where your supply curve intersects with your demand curve, right? So let's assume that this is your supply curve. So your equilibrium price, let's just assume $15, right, is your equilibrium price. And let's even say you want to buy steak meat, right? So let's say steak meat. How much would you value some steak meat? So let's say you value it as high as $40, okay? But this is the equilibrium price. So you're willing to pay as much as $40 for that steak meat, but it only sells for $15, right? So of course you're very happy, you're very excited, you get to keep some extra money in your pocket, right? So that is your consumer surplus. So your consumer surplus is basically the difference between how much you're willing to pay, which is your value for the good, and how much you actually pay, right? Your selling price, right? And do you notice what shape this is? What shape does this make? This makes a triangle shape. And what is the formula for triangle? Area of a triangle is calculated as half base times height. So I'm going to take a few quick examples to illustrate how we actually do this. So remember that the lower the price, the higher your consumer surplus, because we want to save some money, and the higher the price, the lower your consumer surplus, right? So for instance, if there's a drought or famine in the land, and that makes the price of the goods go up, what that means is that your consumer surplus is going to go down because the good is more expensive. You're going to buy less of the good. Basically, you're spending more in the market because it's more expensive. So your consumer surplus for that good is going to go down. Okay, so now to a quick example. Assuming we have 4 buyers in the market. So let's just say buyers A, B, C, D, right? And then your willingness to pay at this amount here, right? But your equilibrium price, which is the same thing as your market price, remember your invisible hand, your equilibrium price and your market price is $110, right? Okay, so now how many of these consumers do you think are going to remain in this market? Based on what they are able to buy. So demand is based off on your willingness and your ability to buy. So it's not just about being willing. I mean, I want a Lamborghini, but can I afford it, right? Okay, so the market price is $110, but buyer D, let's say Daisy, is only willing to pay $100. So therefore she can't afford to buy this good, right? So Daisy is automatically out of the market. But buyers A, B, and C all have a higher willingness to pay than the market price. So these 3 buyers are going to remain in the market. So now we know that 3 buyers are going to remain in the market. How do we calculate their consumer surplus? Remember what I said, your willingness to pay minus your equilibrium price. So for buyer A, he's willing to pay as much as $150. So $150 minus $110, that's going to give you $40. And then for buyer B, he's willing to pay as much as $135, and that's going to give you a difference of $15. No, $25. That's going to give you a difference of $25, right? So $135 minus $110, that's a difference of $25. How about buyer C? Buyer C is willing to pay as much as $120, so she's able to save $10 because the market price is only $110, right? So now the addition of all of this is going to give you the total consumer surplus in this market, right? So $40 plus $25, that's $65, plus $10, that gives you $75, right? Which is your total consumer surplus, okay? So that is a quick illustration of how you calculate consumer surplus. I'm going to give a more in-depth illustration, and this is based off on so this is how you calculate for a table, right? So in this table, you're only calculating based on how many consumers remain in the market. But in a graphical illustration, you're able to not just see how many people are in the market, you're able to see the quantity of goods that are being demanded, okay? All right, so now at $15, let's assume that 40 units of good are being demanded, right? This is the market price and this is the market quantity. Okay, but now the willingness to pay is as high as $40. So again, these are two different examples that I'm giving you. So you look at this shape. What shape is this? This is a triangle shape. And the difference between the willingness to pay and the equilibrium price is $25. Right? And then how much is being sold at this equilibrium price? 40 units, okay? So therefore, your consumer surplus in terms of calculation is going to be half. The base is how much quantity is sold. Half times 40. And then the height is going to be the difference in the price, the willingness to pay, and the equilibrium price. So times 25, okay? So 20 times 25, that should give you about $500. I think my math is mathing. Okay, so that is how you calculate consumer surplus, okay, in a very simple illustration. Now, how about when there is an increase in price? So when there's an increase in price, or actually we could even let's go with a decrease in price. We all love cheaper prices, so let's go with a decrease in price. So when price decreases, right? So let's say they're doing the sales and then the price goes all the way to $10. Now, you know, based on your law of demand, the quantity demanded is going to increase, right? So let's say it goes all this way and you have 50 units now being demanded at $10, okay? So this is your point A and this is your new point B. What is going to happen to the consumer surplus? The consumer surplus is definitely going to increase because the price is cheaper, right? But now, how much of that is based off on old sellers versus how much of that is based off on new sellers? So you know when they are doing promo or sales, you're going to have new people entering the market because the price is cheaper, right? And then you're still going to have the old buyers who are in the market. So this proportion, this rectangle shape, is going to be based off on the old buyers who were in the market originally, and then this shaded parts, this triangle shape, is going to be based off on the new buyers that are entering the market because of the cheaper price, okay? So let's calculate the new consumer surplus is going to be half. What is the base? So now you have 50 units being demanded. So that is your base. And then what is your height? So willingness to pay was as high as $40, but now it's $10. So 40 minus $10 is going to give you $30, right? Okay, so that is going to give you, all right, 25 times 30, 25 times 3, that should give you 75. So how much of this increase in consumer surplus is due to the old buyers? So that is going to be this rectangle proportion. And what is the area of a rectangle? The area of a rectangle is base times height, okay? So the difference in this, the base is still going to be 40 for this rectangle. So rectangle, area of a rectangle. So that's going to be 40 for the base, 40 units being demanded, times your height, which is the difference in the price, $15 minus $10, that is $5, okay? So this is $200 that is due to the old buyers in the market. Now, for the old buyers, okay? How about those that are due to the new buyers? So that is going to be, again, the area of a triangle, and which is half base times height. So this shaded portion is a small triangle, and the difference in the base is 50 units minus 40 units, right? So that is how much extra is being demanded as a result of the drop in price. So that is times 10 units. And then how about the height? The height is difference of $15 minus $10, so that is $5. So that is going to give you, so $25 is going to be due to the influx of new buyers, right? So therefore, your consumer surplus is going to increase by $200 from the old buyers who buy more products due to the price drop, and plus $25 for the new buyers who enter the market due to the price drop, okay? So your consumer surplus literally increases by 200 plus $25. $225, right? So that is how consumer surplus increases as a result of a decrease in price. So you always have to be sure of the shape, and then from there you calculate your consumer surplus, right? And if you notice, when we calculated the increase in consumer surplus using the whole triangle, there's an extra $25 missing, right? So it's going to be $250 when you calculate the difference between this old consumer surplus and the new consumer surplus, right? It should be $250, but this is $225 is gained due to the buyers buying more, including like old buyers and new buyers buying more quantity of the good as a result of the price drop. The remaining $25 is absorbed in the market, right? Which is what the company benefits. Okay. So something else that I really want to emphasize is when you're talking about consumer surplus, it has to be directly related to the price of that good, right? So you know how we have substitute goods and complementary goods. The price of a related good would affect the quantity demanded or the demand of a related good, right? But it doesn't affect the consumer surplus of a related good. So if I'm looking at this marker, right, a change in the price of this marker would affect the consumer surplus of this marker. So if the price of this marker drops, then the consumer surplus of this paper towel may or may not increase or decrease, regardless of the fact that these are complementary goods and these are used together, right? So for related goods, the consumer surplus of good X doesn't relate to the price of good Y, right? So it's directly the price of good Y that you are for sure affects the consumer surplus of good Y, right? So in this case, we're looking at apples, right? So the change in the price of apple is directly for sure going to affect the willingness to pay the consumer surplus of apple. It doesn't have anything to do with orange, which is a related good. It could be a substitute good or a complementary good, okay? So that's something I want to emphasize. So now we have this example on the board, and we have the willingness to pay of different consumers A, B, and C, right? And now let's assume we have a range of market price, okay? How do we calculate how much is going to be bought in this market? So we've done a similar example right here, but this example was just based on a fixed market price of $110. But now when you have a range of a market price from 25 cents to 75 cents, how do you calculate how much is going to be bought in the market? So notice how this is less than, it doesn't have equal to, it's just less than, right? So that means your actual price is ranging from 26 cents to 27 cents all the way to 74 cents. So do you understand that? Okay, so that is the actual market price that we're looking at. So now let's take consumer A, right? Consumer A is willing to pay as high as $2 for the first apple. $2 is definitely greater than the highest maximum price of 74 cents. So definitely consumer A is going to buy the first apple. How about the second apple? $1.5 willingness to pay is definitely greater than 74 cents actual market price. So she's going to buy the second apple as well. How about the third apple? 75 cents willingness to pay is definitely greater than 74 cents for the market price. So consumer A is going to buy a total of 3 apples. Okay, how about consumer B? Consumer B is willing to pay as much as $1.5, which is greater than 74 cents. So consumer B is going to buy the first apple. Consumer B's willingness to pay here for the second apple is $1, which is still more than 74 cents. So she's buying the second apple for sure. How about the willingness to pay at 60 cents? 60 cents is less than the highest maximum market price of 74 cents. So therefore, consumer B cannot afford to get the third apple. Consumer B is only going to get 2 apples. How about consumer C? Consumer C has 75 cents willingness to pay, which is 1 cent above the market price. So she's going to buy, right? So that is 1. Consumer C only buys 1 apple. So therefore, the total apples being demanded in this market is going to sum up to 6. All right, so how about the welfare of the firms, the companies, who are the producers? That is known as producer surplus. And that is simply how much they benefit in the market, right? So how do they make their gains in the market? The selling price, which is also known as the equilibrium price. So remember, this is your supply curve. Your supply curve slopes upward, and then you have your demand curve, right? And then the intersection is what forms your equilibrium. Okay, so equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. Right? Okay, so the difference between the market selling price, which is your equilibrium price, and the cost of production, which is the lowest point of the supply curve, right? So I'm going to call this production costs. That gives you your producer surplus. So producer surplus is your equilibrium price, which is also your market price, minus the production cost. And that should give you your producer surplus, right? So therefore, your equilibrium price, your selling price has to be greater than your production cost in order for the producer to make a gain in the market. Okay, so now let's take a quick example. Again, what shape is this? This shape is also a triangle, right? So half base times height. So the same calculation applies to producer surplus. Let's take a hypothetical example. So let's say we have 5 sellers in the market, right? And the cost of production is like this, as high as $1,600 and as low as $800. Okay, but the market price is just $8,150, right? So now, what do you think of seller A? Do you think seller A is going to remain in this market? He's spending $1,600 to produce the good. There's no way he's going to sell for $8,150. That's a loss, right? So seller A is out of the market. How about seller B? Seller B is also out of the market because the cost of production is more than the market price. For seller C, the cost of production is $1,100, so he's willing to sell for $1,150, right? So seller C makes a surplus of $50. And how about seller D? Seller D only spends $900 to produce the good and sells for $1,150, right? So seller D is going to make a profit of $250. How about seller E? Seller E is going to make a profit of $350. So 1,150 minus 800, right? So that's $350. And the combination of everything is going to add up to $650, right? So this is your total producer surplus. This is your total producer surplus, $650, okay? So that is how you calculate producer surplus. So now to take a quick example using a graphical illustration, it's the same concept. You have the formula, so you take that. Okay, so now let's assume equilibrium price is $30, and then the equilibrium quantity is 50 units that are being sold, okay? So therefore, your producer surplus is going to be, your producer surplus is simply going to be half. What is your base? Your base is 50 units that are sold, times, what is your height? Your height is the difference between $30 and the cost of production. Let's assume that cost of production in this graph is just $5, right? So that means the gain is going to be $30 minus $5, which is $25, okay? So by the time you do your algebra, okay, so half times 50 units sold times $25, which is the difference between your market price and your cost of production. So half times 50 times 25, that's going to give you 25 times 25, which is $625 for your producer surplus, right? So now again, let us assume that the price changes. Let's assume that the price goes up because producers like higher prices, and if the price goes up, then the producer surplus is going to go up because they'll be willing to produce more and sell at a higher price. If the price goes down, then producer surplus is going to go down, okay? So now let's assume that the price goes up, right? Let's say the price goes up to $40, right? So you see that they're willing to supply this much goods, okay? All right, so let's say they're willing to supply as much as 65 units of this good, okay? So now remember, initially you had the old producer surplus was half times 50 units times $25, which gives you 625, right? And now your new producer surplus is going to be, so remember, you want to know how much of this increase in producer surplus is due to old versus new sellers, okay? So I'm just going to take out the demand curve so that it's very easy to see what is going on. All right, okay. So now you can see that the increase in this consumer surplus can be divided into two parts, right? So you have your rectangle parts and you have your shaded parts. And the rectangle part is due to the old sellers that were already in the market, and then the shaded part is due to the new sellers, okay? So this is your new and this is your old, okay? So now let's calculate. How much of this increase in producer surplus is due to the old? So what shape is this? It's a rectangle. So the difference in the price, let's start with the base. Base times height is the area of a rectangle. So area of rectangle, okay? Base times height, how much is sold? So at this, you have 50 units being sold. And then how much quantity? How much is the increase in the price? $10. $40 minus $30. So that's $10, okay? So that's going to give you $500. And then how about, and this $500 is due to the old sellers, okay? And then how much of this area, how much of the increase in producer surplus is due to the new sellers, right? So that would be the area of a triangle, half base times height. So this is your base and this is your height. For this, half base times height. Okay, so half times, which one is your base? So you look at this shape of the triangle, 65 minus 50 units, that gives you 15 units, okay? And then how about the difference in the height? The difference in the height, $40 minus $30, that gives you $10. So 2 divided here, 15 times $5 multiplied times half. So that's going to give you $75, which is due to the new sellers. So the increase in the price, which led to the increase in the producer surplus, is going to give $500 producer surplus for the old sellers, plus $75 extra producer surplus for the new sellers, okay? So that's a total of $575 extra producer surplus, okay? In addition to the $625 that was in the market already. And of course, the rest is what the market gains. Okay, so let's say you have a question that asks you to find the market price, which is the equilibrium price, right? So basically, you know that your producer surplus is the difference between your market price and your production cost. So if you have a question that asks you to find the market price, all you need to do is simple algebra, bring production cost to the other side. So equilibrium price or market price is going to be equal to your producer surplus plus your production cost, right? Okay. And the same thing applies for willingness to pay. So this is chapter 8, and we're going to be covering application. So we're going to apply taxation. So when government imposes tax, on goods and services, what does it mean for the welfare of the consumers, the producers, right? Okay, so remember without tax, in chapter 7 we covered consumer surplus and producer surplus, right? Without tax, right? So that's just basically this, where you have your price or quantity, you have your equilibrium price, you have your equilibrium quantity, and then we talked about consumer surplus is the difference between your willingness to pay and the actual equilibrium price. So willingness to pay is the highest point of the curve, right, of your demand curve, which is here, and this whole gap, the difference between the willingness to pay and your equilibrium price, gives you your consumer surplus. So basically this whole triangle, right? This whole triangle. Okay. And remember, there could be like increase in price. So if there's an increase in price, then the consumer surplus is definitely going to reduce to just this upper parts of the triangle, right? So it's just going to be this upper part of the triangle if there's an increase in price. Okay. All right. So basically this, let's just call these letters A, B, and C. Assuming that, market price stays at EP and it doesn't go up, then the consumer surplus is going to be letters A, B, C. Okay, so how about producer surplus? Producer surplus is the exact opposite. Producer surplus is the difference. So remember, consumer surplus is your willingness to pay minus the equilibrium price, and producer surplus is the difference between equilibrium price and the production cost, right? So basically, the difference between this equilibrium price and this low minimum point right here of your supply curve, right? Okay, so this other shape is your producer. So this whole ABC is your consumer surplus, and this whole triangle is your producer surplus. So remember, it's always a triangle, right? Okay, triangle, triangle. Okay, but at the same time, your cost of production could go up, right? If your cost of production goes up, then the producer surplus definitely is going to come down, right? Or if your equilibrium price comes down, then producer surplus is definitely going to reduce as well, right? So there could be any change in price anywhere in between. But now let's assume that we have letters D, E, and F for this lower part of the triangle. So therefore, that is going to represent your producer surplus, right? So D, E, F. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's a very simple case of consumer surplus and producer surplus without tax. So without tax, you only have producers and consumers in the market. So therefore, what is your total surplus? Your total surplus is simply going to be the combination of your consumer surplus and your producer surplus, okay? However, what we're going to be learning in chapter 8 is when there's tax, they now become three economic agents, right? So now you have your consumer surplus for your consumers, you have your producer surplus for your producers, and you have your tax revenue for the governments, okay? So we're going to learn how tax affects and distorts the market, right? Assuming that we have a market equilibrium price of $6, and at $6 you have 10 units that are being demanded in this market, right? And then the government wakes up one morning and decides to say, okay, we need more government revenue for public goods and services, whatnot, and they decide to impose a $5 tax, right? Now remember, based on the elasticity of the good, the buyer or the seller could bear more of the burden, but typically the sellers try to push as much of the tax to the buyers because they have that kind of market power. But if they push too much of the tax burden to the buyers, then it's going to affect the revenue, and they're going to lose out, right? So there's going to be a split of the tax between the buyers and the sellers. So now let's assume that $3 are pushed to the buyers, right? And then the sellers decide to bear $2 of the tax, right? So if the sellers are paying $3 extra and the current price is $6, then that means the buyers are going to be paying as much as $9, right? Okay, for this good. Okay, and at $9, of course, you know that the buyers are going to respond by buying less of the good. So let's say because of the increase in price to $9, then the buyers only end up buying, let's see, 5 units of the good. Okay, all right. So there's an increase in price and law of demand. There's a reduction in quantity demanded. Okay, so you can tell that before the tax was imposed, this whole triangle from this willingness to pay right here up to the $6, this whole triangle was your consumer surplus, right? But now that you have tax imposed and the buyers are paying more tax to the government through the sellers, then you can see that the consumer surplus is reduced to only this triangle. So now this triangle, this little triangle up here is the only consumer surplus. So you see how much the consumer surplus shrinks due to the increase in price. Okay, now how about the sellers? The sellers have to bear $2 out of the $5 tax, and what that means is that they're going to receive less money, right? Because they have to pay their portion to the government. So if the sellers are receiving $2 less, then that would mean the sellers are only receiving $4. Okay? So now the sellers are receiving $4 and only 5 units of the good are being sold. So again, remember, before the tax was imposed, the producer surplus was this whole big triangle right here. This whole big triangle, right? So we called it DEF, remember? And then the consumer surplus was ABC. But now that the tax has been imposed, the seller's producer surplus has shifted, right? So now it is just, this is only how much they're receiving, right? So they're only receiving from $4 up to the cost of production, right? So this is how much they receive. The rest is remitted to the government. So they only have this tiny portion, right? So based on the numbers we distributed before, the consumer surplus now has only reduced from A, B, C, is now only A, right? And now, based on what we had before, we had D, E, F, but this tiny portion, which is the F, is what the producers are left with, right? So producer surplus now is only equal to F. Do you see what is happening? So what happens to these other two portions? This part of the B, which was part of the consumer surplus, now is no longer part of the consumer surplus. Where does it go to? It goes to what we call the tax revenue. So now remember, in this market, we have an additional player, which is the government imposing the tax, right? So the tax revenue is the amount of the tax imposed times the quantity of the goods sold. In this case, we know that the amount of tax imposed is $5, right? And the buyers are paying $3 of the tax, which is where this letter B, goes to, right? The extra $3 that the buyers are paying. And this letter D, D for donkey, is the extra $2 that the sellers are remitting to the government, right? So the combination of $3 B plus D is going to give you the $5 tax, right, which the government imposes. And how about the quantity that's being sold? So the quantity that's being sold is just when you drag it down here at this new price, right, of $9 and $4, you see that only 5 units are being sold, right? So therefore, the tax revenue is going to be equal to $5 tax times 5 units being sold, basically equal to $25, right? So you see that the government is getting $25. But how much producer surplus has been lost? By the time you calculate this C, this part which was initially called C, is the consumer surplus that was lost. Remember, it used to be ABC and now it's just A. So the consumers lost B to the government, and the consumers are going to lose C to the market due to inefficiency. Okay, so remember. And what shape is this C? It's also a triangle, right? So therefore, let's actually quickly do it. So we want to calculate deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is how much surplus is lost in the market, right? So loss in consumer surplus plus the producer surplus loss, okay? And the consumer surplus is equivalent to C. The producer surplus loss is equivalent to E, actually, okay? So we want to calculate the shapes for C and E, right? Okay, so we know that these shapes for C and E are triangles, right? So half base times height. What is the base? So the difference between how much was demanded before, which is 10 units, and how much is being demanded now, which is 5 units, right? So half times 5 units times, what is the height? The extra $3 that the consumers are paying, right? So times $3. So $15 divided by 2, that's going to give you $7.5, okay? So that is for C. How about for E? It's the same concept, half base times height. The base is the same. 5 units less goods are being demanded. And how about the height? $6 minus $4, that's the $2 tax, the $2 that the sellers have to remit, okay? So 5 times 2 gives you $10 divided by 2, which gives you $5, okay? So the consumers are losing $7.5 and the producers are losing $5. That adds up to $12.5, okay? So you see that the deadweight loss is $12.5 and the government gains $25, okay? So the government is gaining tax revenue at the expense of the producers and the surplus, okay? So that is what deadweight loss means. And that is how the consumer surplus and the producer surplus shrinks while the tax revenue goes up, okay? How about the total surplus with tax? So we know that the total surplus without tax is just consumer surplus plus producer surplus. But the total surplus with tax is consumer surplus plus producer surplus plus total revenue, okay? So in this case, you calculate the consumer surplus. You could do the calculation by yourself. Okay, so the last thing I want to explain in chapter 8 is something called the Laffer curve. So basically what this means is that the higher the tax revenue, right? So the government initially imposes a tax, you still buy the product, right, even though you have to pay more. But as the tax increases, you reduce your quantity of the product. But because the price is so high, even though you're reducing your quantity of the product, the government is still making their money, right? So they're still getting the tax revenue. But if the government gets too confident or, gets too excessive and raises the tax way high, right, it raises the tax too high, then eventually the tax revenue is going to decline, right? So increase in tax leads to increase in tax revenue up to a certain point when it reaches its peak, and then the tax revenue is going to eventually decline if tax continues to increase, right? So this is how the Laffer curve looks, and it just shows that tax cannot be too excessive. If not, the government is going to lose out on the tax revenue because the consumers are going to stop reducing their demand for the product and just switch to another product entirely, right? So the government is going to lose out on tax revenue for that market. However, deadweight loss is totally opposite. So deadweight loss is just, remember, deadweight loss is this portion, right? This triangle portion here. The higher the tax, the higher the deadweight loss. So that doesn't go in opposite directions, right? So no matter how high tax is, deadweight loss is going to keep on increasing, right? So that just tells you that the tax really distorts the market, and if tax gets too excessive, then the inefficiency in the market is just going to be exorbitant, right? So the deadweight loss graph is going to look something like this. It's upward sloping, it's forever increasing, right? So the higher the tax, the higher the deadweight loss, okay? All right. I might as well just call this DL, deadweight loss for DL. Okay, and that's that for chapter 8.